Logitech's Make Play Magical sale is happening now, and my code Datto10 is stacking with it. Go to logi.gg/Datto to get some holiday shopping started. Mask of Fealty, as of the beginning of November 2024, is now actually working properly, and I wanted to wait until it was actually working properly before giving it an in-depth look. In playing with it a bunch recently, I thought this exotic and build were pretty good, but I wasn't really paying that much attention to it. After actually sitting down, looking at gameplay, and giving it a closer look, I think this build is gonna stay relegated to a few select activities for me. Mask of Fealty, playing into Episode 2's Stasis theming, is a Stasis exotic. Withering Blade hits make a small crystal and refund some melee energy, about 7.5%. Using a blade on a frozen target or a crystal releases a spread of more blades. So, Withering Blade as an ability definitely has some history as more of a PvP thing compared to anything else really in the game, especially in its early days where it might as well have been automatically tracking to a target. In PvE though, it's mostly taken a back seat to other setups like Renewal Grasp builds that primarily use Dustfield grenades to make defense, or even Mask of Backrest to prioritize dodging. Withering Blade has some utility in its slow, stunning overload champions, but slows on their own were rarely that desirable. You really wanted the freeze over the slow, and anything that could freeze outright was gonna try to take some priority. Grim Harvest did give some benefits for slow, but I'm not sure the desire to build exclusively around it was that high. Now, Withering Blade gets to be the main star of the show. It continues to slow, but can now freeze targets as well, as a blade hit will freeze the primary target with a stasis crystal. I would say that's really the primary benefit of it in endgame content. 2-in-1 champion stunning. The extra blades for your more enemy-rich environments are incredibly nice though. Your AoE potential goes through the roof, and the melee energy gains can be very substantial, allowing you to spam your melees quite often. Aspect-wise, Grim Harvest is the engine of this build. Killing slowed or frozen enemies makes stasis shards, which give both you and your team melee energy, but also provide you with frost armor. Both your offense and defense are provided in this single aspect. Your second aspect is a bit more up for debate. Touch of Winter buffs your grenades. Winter's Shroud allows for more anti-champion capabilities, melee charges, freezing, slowing, all that kind of stuff. Shatter Dive is just kind of for the enjoyment of it. I've mainly been playing with Touch of Winter on Glacial Grenade so that I have an on-demand set of stasis crystals to throw a blade at. Winter's Shroud is also another option if you really want to dial in on pretty much only spamming your melee attack. Fragment-wise, I've been using Shards, Fissures, Conduction, Hunger, and just a random fifth. Fissures, to me, is an insta-grab. You're going to be exploding frozen targets and crystals quite a lot. Shards has felt almost mandatory in most stasis builds, and while it's not technically mandatory here, you're shattering crystals so often that you might as well take it for some more grenades. Conduction I use purely as a convenience thing. You're making so many stasis shards that running around and grabbing all of them all of the time is just really annoying and slow. In high difficulty solo content, you're not really going to be able to rush into a group of shards to pick them up all the time, but being able to get close and have them come to you is kind of a big deal if you want to keep the melee engine rolling. The lower in difficulty you go, or the less you don't mind running around to pick up shards, the more you can rotate something else in for conduction that has a more tangible benefit, but I do think that the convenience is very nice. Hunger is my way of making sure I actually interact with the shard mechanic even more by giving me more energy per shard. Having to sacrifice 20 strength isn't that big of a deal though when you're able to dodge very often to just replenish your melee energy that way. You could argue that Conduction and Hunger maybe feels like a bit overkill, but I am trying to keep the experience somewhat simple. The fifth slot is wide open. There are a lot of viable options here, to the point where I do not think there is a correct answer. Rhyme isn't bad. It's completely passive and just gives the ability to get more frost armor stacks. Rending, break crystals easier, fine. Refraction or class energy, pretty easy choice there. Impetus, reloading of weapons, another convenience thing. Look around, play with what you like or what you think you need or just whatever you want, really. Stats-wise, max out that resilience and put a healthy amount into discipline. I have more strength than discipline just because this was the best way that I was able to math out my stats at the time, but you should try to get some discipline since you should be restoring your melee energy from things other than strength. Mod-wise, if you just wanted to stack a bunch of melee mods like hands-on and heavy-handed, I would not blame you at all for that. Just going all in on those mods. I preferred to take more of a hybrid approach, but that's because I use my weapons a fair amount in this build, and I also skew towards higher difficulty content, where triggering those kinds of things in this build are a lot harder to do. That being said, we're not breaking any molds here, right? Siphons, energy restoration or orb creation in the gloves, recuperation in the boots for some health. This is all very familiar territory. I would say that you could maybe experiment with melee kickstart. I just don't really think you need it on stasis. That being said, I don't really adventure into the world of prismatic for this build because I just want to try to give some attention to stasis specifically. Of course, the artifact is just a game of grab all the stasis stuff and call it a day. Unfortunately, this artifact does have quite a few amount of things that enhance this setup a pretty strong amount. Crystalline Converter, Hail the Storm, Brain Freeze, Served Cold, to name a few. Fortunately, the build does still work without these artifact perks, but they will be missed when they're gone. This build excels in enemy-dense environments, and I would go as far as saying that it basically demands it if you plan on having some high uptime with this setup. This is because the main engine is stasis shards and your ability to create them at a pretty high rate. Your ability to do this is increased if you're actually killing enemies with Withering Blades. Remember, stasis shards come from killing slowed or frozen enemies. The priority is debuffing as much as possible. You can start to see why this is better in high enemy density environments. The Withering Blades that you spawn from killing stuff has the ability to tag a lot of other things, slowing them, feeding you more shards, and just keeping the cycle going. Contest of Elders, Onslaught, or any other similar activity is the main spot where I think this build really performs. But I also think it's very easy to get lost while running this build. This is not just some set and forget setup. You do need to be pretty active in participating in making the build work, which means throwing good blades and following up on shard collection. Fortunately, you're never really out of the fight because of your dodge giving you a melee charge, but a couple of whiffed blades is gonna set you back a little bit. So, how does it do in other pieces of content? Higher end content. It is okay, but not spectacular. It is usable, but not that impressive. You might have seen me most recently use this setup in the Inverted Spire GM, and yeah, not my favorite. Turns out throwing some dinky blades at GM level enemies doesn't do as much as you might think. You do have some great anti-champion tech with the slows and the freezes, but this job could also be done by a fusion rifle. Withering Blades do run out pretty quick if you're using them to stun overload champions more than once. My experience running Legend Lost Sectors was hit or miss. One Lost Sector was not that smooth of an experience, Extraction in the Throne World, for many reasons, which we'll discuss. But then running Sepulture went incredibly smoothly to the point where I think I would be writing a completely different video if I only played one or the other instead of both. In Extraction, enemies spread out a bit more, they trickle in really slowly, the elevation of the place is kind of all over the place in certain areas, and it's just generally not that well set up to handle this kind of build, in my opinion. But in Sepulture, enemies group up nice and compact, the runes are smaller, there's not that slow of a trickle. That's why I feel like it's a little hit or miss. Inverted Spire GM, kind of a miss for me. This build, I wasn't really vibing. Birthplace of the Vile, definitely an easier GM, pretty smooth experience as a result, although whether or not that's the GM being easy or the build being good is very up for debate. Let's talk about some of the issues that I had when things weren't feeling great. Number one, it's very easy to fall into the trap of just using Withering Blades like how you should probably be using Withering Blades. For me, that means initiating with them, getting a frozen target, and then making a crystal or slowing them, whatever. That sounds really stupid to say, but a big chunk of the exotic perk is that you need to throw blades specifically at frozen targets or crystals, not just use them on anything. I went about halfway through a Lost Sector before realizing I don't think I threw a single blade that would activate the other perk on this exotic. This is why I chose Glacial Grenade. I initiate with this grenade, and then I blade it to shatter everything, and I spawn more blades, and I spawn more shards, and I get the engine rolling. Whisper of Shards should keep your grenade regen pretty healthy. This is more of a minor negative, though, as it doesn't really take that long to get into the right habits and build that muscle memory, but it's still pretty easy to zone out sometimes if you're not paying attention. Also, if you are using a headstone weapon, which I semi-recommend, you can, of course, use that to generate stasis crystals and then throw your blades at those. Number 2. Like I said earlier, the artifact is helping a good amount here. The build is usable without the artifact, but the artifact does give this experience a nice boost to the point where I'm not too sure how much I'll want to revisit it after this artifact leaves the game. Number 3 is uneven floors. I feel like if I shatter a crystal and enemies aren't at the same elevation, that nothing happens. Even if in actuality it's not a problem at all and things do happen, it just feels sometimes like nothing happens, but we'll talk about this in a sec. This also isn't exclusively a Lost Sector problem. Number 4, blades from a distance aren't that great because they track enemies. Again, which I realize sounds kind of stupid, but if you're trying to throw a blade at a stasis crystal and they aim assist super hard to an enemy, which basically always happens, chances are that it might not hit either target at all. Even besides that, I've frequently had blades just completely whiff from farther distances. Number 5, and this is probably my biggest point, while this build has a lot of spectacle, it doesn't feel like that spectacle pays out in the form of killing all the things that I think should be dying to such an effect. One quick example I can give is that with this grenade plus melee combo, plus shatters, plus extra blades popping out, you would think that 3 acolytes in this area would die in a Legend Lost Sector. They do not. Now, this isn't an all-the-time thing, but the fact that all of these abilities going off couldn't handle 3 acolytes is a little concerning when I could instead just tap them out with a few machine gun shots and do it arguably much faster than this whole combo going out. By extension, sometimes I just have the feeling that the blades from a crystal or a frozen target aren't really doing that much at all, because I just can't really notice it because it's tough to notice. It can feel difficult to see what's actually happening sometimes. When I'm using Glacial Grenade, I throw a blade at a giant wall, it shatters, it creates a million particles, and then I'm supposed to tell where some blades are going after that? Is not a chance, right? In less intense shatter situations, you can actually see the blades, but whether or not they actually tag something is anyone's guess at all. You only get 3 blades that pop out. And in Legend content, like this Lost Sector, you're not really one-shotting anything that's an actual threat with a blade. Thrall and Dregs at the most. So those blades are just flying into Narnia for all I know. The higher you go in difficulty, the less you'll be able to kill with one blade. This is why this setup pops off a bit more in the easier stuff. The chain potential is so much higher. Blades that spawn from blades might actually kill things. So the things you want this build to do actually happen with some regularity in that lower end content. Once you start to go above that stuff, it's just tougher to pull off, and it's just not as satisfying either because stuff doesn't die as easily. You also just have to generally play a lot slower the more difficult something is, so doing something like maintaining frost armor stacks for a very long time, not the easiest thing in the world. I think I'm making it sound like worse than it actually is. I still enjoy the build in low stakes content. It's pretty fun in that kind of stuff, and it can have its moments in upper tier content. But it's not a perfect setup. It's not a build that I think you would want to run everywhere. It definitely has its faults, has its weaknesses. Also, Stasis in general just does not come with the same tools that other subclasses have to help you stay alive in higher end content. Frost Armor only goes so far. I think some game knowledge is required to take advantage of this setup in higher difficulty content. Mask of Fealty, it's fun, it's flashy, but the harder the content gets, the less I would be inclined to run this setup. And when Episode 2's artifact rotates out, unless something happens to this build or happens to this exotic, I'm not too sure if I'm still going to be running it. Let me know what you think of Mask of Fealty. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.